Hey guys, tonight we'll be diving into one of the most enduring mysteries ever whispered through time, the story of the Great Flood. From ancient myths carved into tablets to the scars hidden deep beneath our oceans, the earth carries a memory of something vast and cataclysmic. But was it all myth, or did something truly happen that reshaped our world forever? So, before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if you enjoy content that merges myth and mystery. And hey, let us know where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. It's time now to dim the lights, and let's cover what we have for tonight. Together, long before the flood, there was a world that seemed almost alien compared to the one we know today. According to ancient records, myths, and geological speculation, Earth was a place of vast balance, lush landscapes, colossal creatures, and civilizations that, in some accounts, stretched their influence across continents now buried beneath layers of time. The pre-flood world wasn't simply a backdrop to a biblical story. It was an era filled with mysteries we can barely comprehend. Imagine a world where the air was thicker, the climate more stable, and the land draped in forests that seemed to go on forever. Some scientists have suggested that the Earth's early atmosphere could have contained higher levels of oxygen, possibly contributing to the massive size of ancient insects and reptiles. In this period, long before modern civilization, nature reigned with a kind of serene dominance. Rivers ran cleaner, the seas were unbroken by plastic and pollution, and every mountain and valley held stories untold. Ancient texts, like those found in Mesopotamia, Egypt, and even pre-Columbian America, describe a golden age before disaster struck. These were times of extraordinary longevity, where humans supposedly lived for centuries. Civilizations reached peaks of understanding, and peace was believed to rule before corruption began to spread. Whether symbolic or literal, these accounts point to one thing, that the ancients believed the flood didn't just wipe out people, it ended an entire way of existence. In the biblical narrative, this was the antediluvian era, the world before the deluge. It's a word that has haunted scholars for centuries. Antediluvian, meaning before the flood. Genesis describes a world of giants, of advanced societies that grew arrogant, forgetting the balance that once held creation together. The sons of God, as the text says, mingled with the daughters of men, and chaos began to take hold. Other cultures mirror this story. The Sumerians spoke of divine kings who ruled for thousands of years before a flood swept over the land. The Greeks told of the age of titans, when gods and mortals walked side by side before a deluge reset everything. But was this poetic metaphor or a distorted echo of real history? If we strip away myth's ornate clothing, we find threads that could point to actual events. Scientists studying ice cores, ancient sediments, and fossil records have discovered evidence that something profound happened to the Earth roughly 12,000 years ago, the end of the last ice age. During that time, global temperatures rose dramatically, ice sheets melted, and sea levels surged by over 100 meters. Entire coastal plains vanished. Could this have been the world remembered as before the flood? Before this massive shift, vast stretches of land connected continents. The English Channel didn't exist yet. Instead, a fertile expanse called Doggerland stretched between Britain and mainland Europe, filled with rivers, forests, and human settlements. To the east, parts of what is now the Persian Gulf were once lush valleys where early civilizations thrived, and across the planet, sea levels were so much lower that islands we know today were once mountaintops on continuous land. Imagine the perspective of ancient peoples living in those times. They built homes, cultivated land, and developed their first myths under a sun that seemed eternal. They had no concept of global climate shifts or tectonic activity, only the rhythms of nature they trusted. And then, one generation after another, the waters began to rise. At first, perhaps slowly, rivers swollen, shorelines creeping inward. But then, as glaciers collapsed and oceans surged, entire regions disappeared beneath waves. To those who lived through it, it must have felt as if the sky itself had opened. But before that final cataclysm, the earth was stable for thousands of years. Archaeologists have unearthed tools, carvings, and remnants of culture from this period, often in places now far underwater. Off the coast of India, near Dwarka, there are submerged ruins that date back to around 9,000 years ago. Off Japan's Yonaguni coast, strange terraces and formations, some say man-made, lie hundreds of feet below the sea. Could these be relics of that pre-flood civilization, preserved beneath centuries of sediment and silence? Many ancient texts describe the pre-flood world as one of harmony, but also hubris. Humanity had grown powerful, too powerful. The Sumerian king list records rulers who reigned for tens of thousands of years, ending with the cryptic phrase, "Then the flood swept over." Whether this reign refers to symbolic ages or actual dynasties, the implication is clear. A long era ended abruptly. Some believe the legends of great longevity may echo early humanity's closer connection to nature, perhaps even to a different environment that supported longer lifespans. Others interpret it as mythic storytelling, a way for ancient peoples to convey a fall from grace. The Bible, the Torah, and even Islamic tradition all agree that before the flood, humanity had turned from the divine path. Violence, greed, and corruption spread across the land. The world, once pure, had become unrecognizable. Whether you see this as allegory or ancient memory, it paints a vivid image, a civilization standing at the height of its power, blind to the storm on the horizon. From a geological standpoint, the pre-flood Earth was still recovering from glacial retreat. Megafauna, like mammoths, saber-toothed cats, and giant sloths, roamed the lands. Ice covered much of the northern hemisphere, but temperate regions flourished. Rivers like the Tigris, Euphrates, and Nile formed fertile crescents that cradled the first human communities. Early humans, whether Homo sapiens or remnants of earlier species, were learning to cultivate crops, domesticate animals, and construct early forms of architecture. It was a period of profound transformation. The seeds of civilization were being sown, and the planet itself was on the verge of dramatic change. Then, there's the atmospheric question. Some researchers propose that the Earth's pre-flood climate was governed by a vapor canopy, a thick layer of water vapor that shielded the planet from harmful radiation and created a greenhouse-like uniformity. Though speculative, this theory attempts to explain why ancient texts describe long lifespans and a global paradise. If such a canopy collapsed, it could have unleashed unprecedented rainfall, possibly triggering massive flooding. Whether literal or not, the imagery of the windows of heaven opening remains one of the most powerful in human storytelling. As we look back, the pre-flood earth becomes both a mystery and a mirror. It's a world that reminds us of what stability can become when taken for granted. It's the calm before history's greatest storm, an age where humanity had everything, yet perhaps lost itself in the pursuit of more. So, before the flood came roaring across the world, there was peace, or something close to it, a balance of life and nature that may have lasted thousands of years. But in the silence of that ancient age, something was building, something vast, unstoppable, and world-altering. If you were to travel across the ancient world, from the peaks of the Andes to the river valleys of Mesopotamia, from the islands of the Pacific to the frozen tundra of Siberia, you'd find something astonishing. Nearly every culture, separated by thousands of miles and with no means of communication between them, tells a story of a great flood. These tales vary in detail. Different gods, different heroes, different causes, yet the essence remains the same. Once, long ago, the world drowned. It is one of humanity's most universal memories. In Mesopotamia, the cradle of civilization, the flood story appears on one of the oldest known pieces of literature, the Epic of Gilgamesh. Written on clay tablets over 4,000 years ago, it tells of Utnapishtim, a righteous man warned by the gods that a great deluge was coming to cleanse the earth of human corruption. Utnapishtim built a massive boat, filled it with his family and the seed of all living things, and survived the storm that swallowed the land. When the waters receded, his vessel came to rest upon a mountain, and a dove, then a raven, were sent out to search for dry ground. Sound familiar? The parallels to the biblical tale of Noah are striking, suggesting that both may trace back to an even older story, one perhaps rooted in real catastrophe. Further east in India, the ancient text Satapatha Brahmana speaks of a man named Manu who is warned by a small fish that a great flood will soon come. The fish grows to enormous size, revealed to be the god Vishnu, and helps Manu build a boat that carries him, along with the seeds of life, to safety atop a mountain. Manu, like Noah and Utnapishtim, becomes the ancestor of a new world. The Chinese have their own account. In their legends, the flood was not sent to destroy mankind, but was a cosmic imbalance, a disruption in the harmony of heaven and earth. Emperor Yu, known as Yu the Great, became a hero by learning to control the waters instead of fleeing them. Through wisdom, engineering, and persistence, he dredged rivers and opened channels, restoring balance to the world. Here, the flood becomes not divine punishment, but a test of human endurance, a theme that would echo through many Asian cultures for millennia. Across the Pacific, the ancient Hawaiians told of Nu'u, who built an ark and survived when the gods covered the world in water. After the flood, Nu'u mistakenly offered sacrifices to the moon, believing it to be the creator, and the god Cain descended on a rainbow to correct him. Even here, on remote islands thousands of miles from Mesopotamia, the same pattern emerges: destruction, survival, renewal. Travel south to the lands of the Aztecs and Mayans, and you find the same whispers. The Aztecs spoke of the god Tezcatlipoca, who warned a man named Nata and his wife Nena to hollow out a great cypress tree to survive the flood that would end the fourth sun, one of the previous ages of the world. The Mayan Popol Vuh tells of a flood sent by the gods to wash away their first creation, beings made of wood, because they lacked souls and gratitude. In the aftermath, humanity was remade from corn, a new creation for a renewed world. Even among indigenous tribes of North America, the pattern persists. The Ojibwe speak of a great flood that covered the earth, with only a few animals and one man surviving on a raft. A muskrat, diving deep into the water, brought up a bit of mud that the Creator used to rebuild the land. The Hopi tell of an earlier world destroyed by flood because humans turned from spiritual ways. They survived by retreating into the hollow reeds of the world, emerging after the waters withdrew from Alaska to the Amazon. The story repeats, different names, different settings, one haunting message. But perhaps the most astonishing part of this global chorus is how similar these accounts are, even in their smallest details. The warning, the vessel, the chosen survivor, the mountain landing, the bird released. These motifs appear again and again across thousands of years and countless languages. Coincidence seems too generous a word. Scholars have spent generations trying to understand why. Some argue that such stories arise naturally. After all, floods are among the most devastating and memorable natural disasters. Every culture that lived near a river or coast would have experienced one eventually. When a community is nearly wiped out by such a force, the memory of that event, retold and exaggerated across centuries, could easily evolve into a myth of global proportions. But others sense something deeper, that these tales are not just independent inventions, but the fragmented memory of a single massive catastrophe that occurred in prehistory, an event so traumatic it imprinted itself on humanity's collective consciousness. The flood stories, then, would be like broken mirrors, reflecting one truth from different angles. Modern geological research adds fascinating context to these myths. For instance, the end of the last ice age brought dramatic sea level rise, sometimes occurring in catastrophic bursts. One well-documented event is the collapse of massive glacial dams that released vast inland lakes in North America, floods that reshaped entire landscapes overnight. Another, known as the Black Sea Deluge, occurred around 7,500 years ago, when rising Mediterranean waters poured through the Bosporus and rapidly expanded the Black Sea basin, drowning thousands of square miles of farmland. Archaeologists now suspect this may have been the historical seed of the Near Eastern flood stories. In Australia, Aboriginal oral traditions recall floods that swallowed coastal plains, stories that match geological data from over 7,000 years ago. In Southeast Asia, submerged ruins near India and Japan align with similar periods of rising sea levels. Could all these accounts, scattered yet consistent, be remembering the same epical moment when the world's coastlines redrew themselves? If so, the flood wasn't necessarily global in the literal sense, not covering every mountain, but global in experience. To each community, the world they knew, the entirety of existence, was drowned, and so, in their memory, it became the whole world that perished. The universality of flood myths speaks not only to shared trauma, but also to shared hope. In every version, there is survival, a seed of renewal. The survivors are chosen, wise or virtuous. They become the new ancestors of humankind. Whether by divine favor or sheer determination, they endure. The flood wipes away corruption, yes, but it also offers a clean slate, a second chance. Perhaps that is why these stories have lasted so long. They are not only about destruction, but about rebirth. They carry both warning and comfort. They remind us that even in the face of overwhelming chaos, life finds a way to begin again. And so, when you hear the same story, whispered in so many tongues, in deserts, jungles, mountains, and islands, you have to wonder, did all humanity wake from the same nightmare? Or are we simply united by the way we remember tragedy, transforming terror into meaning, loss into lesson? Whichever you believe, the Great Flood stands as a bridge between myth and memory, between history and imagination. It's a story not confined to any single culture, but shared by all of humanity. A story told not once, but thousands of times, by different voices, yet always ending with the same quiet line. The waters rose, and the world was never the same again. It must have begun with silence, that eerie, heavy quiet that settles before the sky breaks open. Somewhere in that ancient world, people must have looked up and seen the first strange clouds rolling in from the horizon. The air grew thick, the wind restless, and the heavens dimmed. And then, without warning, the first drops fell, soft, harmless at first, before the sky itself seemed to collapse. Every ancient text that speaks of the Great Flood describes this moment differently, but always with the same undertone of terror and awe. In the book of Genesis, it says, "The fountains of the great deep burst forth, and the windows of heaven were opened." In the Sumerian Epic of Gilgamesh, the storm and flood came together like twin beasts. The rain did not simply fall, it roared, driven by winds and thunder that tore apart mountains and valleys. For 40 days and 40 nights, the world became a sea. But if we look beyond myth, beyond poetry, what could have actually caused this? Could rain alone flood the entire earth? Or was there something far greater at work? Something from within the earth itself? Let's begin with the skies. Around the end of the last ice age, roughly 12,000 years ago, global temperatures rose at an extraordinary rate. Vast glaciers that once blanketed North America, Europe, and Asia began to melt. These glaciers held unimaginable quantities of fresh water, trillions of tons of it, locked in ice for millennia. When they melted, the water didn't just fill rivers and lakes, it poured into the oceans, raising sea levels by more than 100 meters. But melting ice alone wasn't enough to create the kind of devastation remembered by humanity. The most violent floods we know of were triggered by something far more sudden: the collapse of natural ice dams that once held back colossal glacial lakes. In North America, there was a lake so vast it dwarfed the Great Lakes combined, Lake Agassiz. When its icy walls finally gave way, billions of gallons of water exploded into the Atlantic, carving out channels, reshaping landscapes, and possibly even disrupting ocean currents. The event was so powerful that some scientists believe it triggered the Younger Dryas, a rapid cooling period that plunged the Earth back into near glacial conditions for over 1,000 years. Imagine what that would have looked like: an unstoppable torrent sweeping across continents, forests ripped from their roots, Animals and settlements erased in minutes. To the people who witnessed it, if any survived, it must have seemed as though the sky and sea had become one. Then there are the fountains of the deep. Many ancient sources don't just mention rain, but water erupting from below. To the ancients, this might have meant springs or fissures breaking open. But geologically, it could point to something even more dramatic: tectonic upheaval. When massive fault lines shift or volcanoes erupt under the ocean, the displacement can cause immense waves. Tsunamis so large, they travel thousands of miles. One possible explanation for the flood could be a chain reaction: melting ice, increasing ocean weight, triggering seismic activity beneath the seas, releasing underground reservoirs, and unleashing catastrophic tsunamis. Add to that torrential rain from a warming atmosphere, and the stage is set for a global scale disaster. There's another layer too, one that ties into mythic descriptions of the sky opening. During periods of a sudden temperature change, the atmosphere becomes unstable. Volcanic eruptions can darken the skies with ash, reflecting sunlight and cooling the planet, while simultaneously releasing greenhouse gases that trap heat. Massive eruptions could have blackened the sun, turned day to night, and created rainfall laced with ash and sulfur, or what some ancient cultures might have called the wrath of the gods. Some geologists point to the Lacher Sea eruption in present-day Germany around 12th 1900 years ago, an explosion 10 times more powerful than Mount St. Helens, which sent shockwaves across Europe. Combined with other eruptions, meteor impacts, and glacial collapse, it's easy to imagine an era when nature unleashed everything at once. And then there's a hypothesis far more cosmic in scale, that a fragment of a comet or asteroid may have struck Earth, igniting wildfires, vaporizing ice, and creating instant flooding. Evidence of microscopic glass spherules, carbon soot, and elevated iridium levels in sediment layers from around 12,900 years ago support this theory, known as the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. If true, it would have been apocalyptic. Oceans would have boiled at the surface, rainfall would have poured from superheated clouds, and shock waves would have flattened entire forests. Whether it was glacial collapse, volcanic fury, tectonic upheaval, or something cosmic, the result was the same. The sky opened, and the world was transformed. The psychological impact on ancient humans must have been profound. Imagine standing on familiar land, a valley where your ancestors had lived for generations, and watching it vanish in hours. Imagine the sound. Not just rain, but thunder, so deep it shook the ground. Wind so strong it stripped trees bare. Waves that moved faster than horses could run. People would have fled to the highlands, clinging to survival, as lightning flashed across endless gray skies. They must have believed the gods had turned against them. Across different civilizations, that terror became story. In the Gilgamesh epic, even the gods themselves were frightened by the magnitude of the storm. They cowered like dogs as the deluge swallowed the earth. In the book of Genesis, it is divine judgment, a cleansing of corruption. In Hindu texts, it is the natural cycle of destruction and renewal. Yet in every case, the tone is the same: humility in the face of forces far beyond human control. To the ancients, the flood was more than just a physical event. It was a rupture in the natural order, the collapse of everything stable, the ground beneath them, The sky above, the seasons they depended on, all turned against them. In that sense, the flood became both literal and spiritual, marking the death of an old world and the painful birth of a new one. When the rain finally stopped and the clouds began to thin, silence would have returned, but it would have been the silence of loss. The survivors would have stood on strange new shores, surrounded by the wreckage of everything they knew. Forests gone, mountains reshaped, the coastline forever altered. The flood, whether caused by divine will or planetary physics, had rewritten the face of the earth. For modern scientists, studying this period is like reading a record written in water and stone. Sediment layers show sudden shifts in composition, bands of silt and sand that shouldn't be there, signs of rapid flooding. Fossil beds reveal abrupt die-offs, suggesting mass extinction events. And everywhere we look, in ice cores, in river deltas, in deep ocean floors, we see the same pattern: chaos followed by renewal. So when ancient texts speak of the windows of heaven opening, they may not have been entirely wrong. Something did open, whether it was the atmosphere, the seas, or the crust of the earth itself. And when it did, it changed everything. The flood wasn't just a storm, it was a convergence, a perfect storm of climate, geology, and catastrophe, an event that echoed through every human memory for millennia. When we talk about the Great Flood, we stand at the crossroads of myth and measurable reality. The image of the whole planet drowned beneath a single, endless ocean is powerful. But could it actually happen? Could every mountain, every desert, every city truly vanish beneath the waves? To answer that, we have to look at the Earth itself, its oceans, its atmosphere, and the deep physics that govern them. Let's start with something simple: the numbers. Today, if we melted every glacier and ice sheet on Earth, sea levels would rise by roughly 70 meters. That's enough to submerge every coastal city and swallow entire countries, but not enough to cover the planet. Mount Everest, at nearly 9,000 meters high, would still stand far above the sea. Even the highest hypothetical rise, if all groundwater and polar ice somehow joined the oceans, would flood only about 1/3 of the continents. So scientifically, a true global flood covering every mountain is almost impossible without rewriting the laws of physics. The Earth simply doesn't hold enough liquid water. Yet this doesn't close the case. What's possible and what's perceived are two very different things. Imagine the world through the eyes of ancient peoples living in river valleys or low coastal plains. When a massive meltwater surge or a tsunami struck, the horizon would become a moving wall of water. To them, that was the world ending. So when their descendants told the story, the flood was not local, it was total. Still, scientists have looked deeper. If rain alone can't drown the earth, could something else have produced an event vast enough to inspire myths on every continent? One answer lies beneath our feet, in the restless plates of the planet itself. The crust of the earth floats atop molten rock, shifting slowly over millions of years. When plates collide or pull apart, they can unleash catastrophic floods. Around 11 million years ago, the Mediterranean Sea almost vanished, sealed off from the Atlantic by a rising land bridge. Then, about 5 million years ago, that barrier collapsed. The Atlantic poured in with unimaginable force, refilling the basin in what geologists call the Zanclean Deluge. In a matter of months, the sea returned, carving Gibraltar's narrow strait. It was, in every sense, a regional apocalypse, proof that nature can, under the right circumstances, fill a sea in the blink of geological time. Events on smaller scales repeat throughout history. Around 7,500 years ago, the Black Sea was a freshwater lake ringed with early Neolithic villages. When rising Mediterranean waters breached the Bosporus, salt water cascaded downward, flooding hundreds of square kilometers. Underwater archaeologists have found ancient shorelines, freshwater mollusks buried under marine species, and the remnants of settlements along the old coast. To the people who lived there, the water would have seemed alive, advancing day after day until it consumed their homes. That single event could have birthed the flood stories of the Near East, which later evolved into the biblical narrative we know. Beyond tectonics, there's another force: glacial outburst floods, sometimes called Jökullaups. Picture an immense lake trapped behind an ice dam. When the ice melts or cracks, the lake escapes in hours, releasing energy equal to thousands of nuclear bombs. These floods carve new valleys and spread silt across continents. In North America, the Missoula floods left behind ripple marks so huge they can be seen from space. The people who later inhabited those regions found landscapes that looked as though giants had plowed the earth. Proof, perhaps, that the world had once drowned. So, yes, the planet has endured floods so vast they defy imagination, but none that submerged every mountain peak. Instead, it has seen many cataclysms: regional deluges, glacial bursts, rising seas, each one erasing entire cultures. When ancient survivors told their stories, these local apocalypses merged in memory into one cosmic event. There is another theory, one that peers far beyond water, that the flood is humanity's metaphor for cycles of destruction written into nature itself. Throughout geological history, Earth has reset itself through mass extinction events: volcanic winters, asteroid impacts, runaway greenhouse phases. Each time, life nearly vanished, then began again. In that sense, the flood is not about literal oceans, but about the rhythm of catastrophe and renewal. When the fossil record shows sudden die-offs, and when sediments reveal chaos, followed by rebirth, we are seeing the planet's own version of the deluge. And yet, there are hints that extraordinary rainfall might once have played a real part. During certain periods, global climate models suggest bursts of extreme precipitation triggered by rapid warming. When ice ages end, the atmosphere holds more water vapor, leading to storms of incredible intensity. In theory, a chain reaction of such storms could pour down over months, while rising seas pushed inland. The ancients would not have seen a gradual rise. They would have seen an endless storm. For them, the sky itself had opened. Scientists also study ocean circulation for answers. The melting of vast freshwater lakes into the oceans can shut down the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation, a system of currents that distributes heat across the planet. When that happens, climates shift violently. Regions freeze, others drown in rainfall. The last major slowdown of this circulation coincides with the Younger Dryas period, right around the time many flood myths are set. Even the possibility of cosmic interference cannot be dismissed outright. A comet impact in the ice fields, for example, could vaporize water and send torrential rains across continents. Geological layers, rich in iridium and nanodiamonds, hint that such an event may have occurred around 12,900 years ago. If so, a flood would have been only part of the devastation. Fires, temperature swings, and ocean upheavals would have followed, giving survivors every reason to speak of divine wrath. So, could a global flood happen again? In the strict physical sense, no. There is not enough free water to drown the planet completely. But in the lived sense, in the way humans experience disaster, the answer is always yes. Even today, climate change melts glaciers, sea levels climb, and storms grow stronger. Entire island nations face submersion within a lifetime. To those who will live through it will feel like the world's end. The ancient story continues, not as myth, but as warning. And here is where myth and science quietly shake hands. The Great Flood may not have been one event. It may have been the collective memory of many. Each culture, remembering its own deluge, added detail, emotion, and divinity until the story became universal. That universality is its power. It shows that no matter where we lived, humanity has always been shaped by water, by its generosity, and by its rage. As we move forward, the question isn't simply whether the flood could happen, but how it changed everything afterward. Because once the waters rose and fell, the earth itself was never the same. Climate, continents, and even life took on new forms. 12,000 years ago, our planet awoke from an age of ice. For nearly 2 million years before that, the earth had been locked in an endless rhythm of freezing and thawing, sculpting continents under the slow hand of glaciers. But then, for reasons still partly mysterious, everything began to shift. The cold retreated, and warmth returned. And with that warmth came water. The end of the last ice age was not a quiet transition. It was a transformation so profound that it reshaped coastlines, flooded valleys, and rewrote the geography of the world. What we now call the rise of the seas was not a gentle lapping of waves. It was a relentless surge, unstoppable and vast, swallowing land at a rate that would terrify any civilization today. Imagine standing on a broad plain, perhaps Doggerland, the fertile land bridge that once connected Britain to mainland Europe. It was home to rivers, forests, and animals. People hunted mammoths there, built temporary camps, and watched their children play along streams that no longer exist. Then, over generations, they began to notice a change. The water crept closer, shorelines shifted, rivers grew wider, deeper, unpredictable. At first, it was subtle, something to adapt to, but soon, it wasn't adaptation that was needed. It was escape. This was not an isolated experience. From Asia to the Americas, the same story unfolded. The Laurentide and Fennoscandian ice sheets, immense frozen empires that had covered much of North America and Northern Europe, began to melt at extraordinary speed. Scientists call this period the Holocene transgression, the great rising of the seas that marked the dawn of our modern world. Between roughly 12,000 and 7,000 years ago, global sea levels rose by over 100 meters. To understand the scale of that, picture an ocean swallowing a city like New York, not in a day or a year, but over generations. yet so steadily that entire regions simply ceased to exist. The Gulf Coast, the North Sea Plains, the Sunda Shelf in Southeast Asia, all were consumed. The shorelines of the world moved inland by miles. And it wasn't only the seas. Rivers carved new paths. Lakes formed and drained in catastrophic bursts. In North America, the colossal glacial lake Agassiz, covering an area larger than all the Great Lakes combined, suddenly released its waters. When its icy barrier failed, it poured into the Atlantic with such force that ocean salinity shifted, disrupting global currents. The Earth's climate, still fragile from warming, was thrown into chaos again. For centuries, the world oscillated between warmth and sudden cold, but the long trend was clear. Ice was dying. What would this have looked like to our ancestors? Imagine you were a hunter living on the Siberian plains, where permafrost once stretched endlessly. One generation, you roam across grasslands. The next, you find the ground turning soft, rivers cutting deeper channels, the animals migrating farther each season. The landscape you knew, the one that had defined your myths, your gods, your home, was melting away before your eyes. The retreat of the ice was more than a geological event. It was a cultural earthquake. Human groups who had lived for millennia in one place suddenly found themselves displaced. Their roots vanished. The coasts they once fished from became seabeds. The mountains they revered became islands. This was the dawn of migration, of movement that would scatter people across continents and oceans. It was the beginning of history as we know it. In some places, this change was apocalyptic. The coastlines of Southeast Asia, now drowned under the waters of the South China Sea, once formed a vast lowland known as Sunderland. There, human settlements thrived, places with fertile soil, abundant water, and gentle climate. When the seas rose, the people fled inland, carrying with them memories of their lost homeland. Some anthropologists believe that these displaced communities brought with them the earliest flood stories, tales of divine waters swallowing the world, preserving in myth what they could not preserve in stone. Similarly, the Persian Gulf basin, now covered by water, was once a lush valley, fed by rivers like the Tigris and Euphrates. Archaeologists believe it may have been a cradle of early civilization, a place where agriculture and trade first took root. When the waters of the Indian Ocean rose, this valley filled, forming the Gulf as we know it. The people who escaped may have carried their memories northward, eventually shaping the Mesopotamian flood myths that inspired the story of Noah. The ice didn't melt evenly. In some regions, it happened in violent pulses. Scientists studying ancient coral reefs have found evidence of meltwater pulses, periods when sea level rose abruptly, sometimes by several meters, in just a few decades. The most famous, known as Meltwater Pulse 1A, occurred around 14,600 years ago. Another, Pulse 1B, came about 2,000 years later. Imagine entire generations watching the ocean climb year by year, faster than they could build, farm, or flee. The physical evidence is everywhere. In the Bahamas and along ancient coastlines, drowned limestone caves reveal stalactites, frozen mid-drip, proof of rising seas. Off India's west coast, sonar scans reveal structures beneath the silt, patterns too geometric to be natural, possibly remnants of settlements. In the English Channel, sonar has mapped ancient riverbeds that once ran through the heart of Doggerland, now lost beneath the waves. This was not merely environmental change, it was the world remaking itself. As ice retreated, it released pressure from the continents, causing the land to rebound upward, a process called isostatic adjustment. Mountains rose, valleys shifted, ocean currents found new paths, altering climate patterns. The gentle equilibrium of the Ice Age shattered, and the Holocene, our current geological epoch, was born in its place. And yet, for all its violence, the end of the Ice Age was also the beginning of everything that followed. It gave humanity new coasts to explore, new rivers to settle beside, new climates in which agriculture could thrive. It turned the Sahara from a lush green paradise into desert, pushing people toward the Nile, where one of the world's first great civilizations would rise. It flooded ancient plains, but it also revealed fertile deltas that became breadbaskets for millennia. It's easy to imagine the sorrow of loss, the sense of watching an old world vanish, but it's just as important to see the transformation it set in motion. The floods of the Ice Age weren't merely disasters, they were catalysts. They forced adaptation, innovation, and resilience. They tested the species that would go on to shape the planet. Still, the echoes of those floods remain deep in human memory. Every generation that lived through the slow drowning of their homeland would have told stories about it, warnings to their children about the power of water, the fragility of land, and the impermanence of all things. Those stories, repeated for centuries, became the flood myths that every civilization carries. But survival was only one part of the story. Floods also reshaped the cultural imagination. Communities who had endured cataclysmic deluges embedded their experiences into myths, rituals, and religious practices. Water became a symbol of both destruction and renewal. In Mesopotamia, the flood myth was central to the Epic of Gilgamesh. In the Hebrew Bible, Noah's Ark illustrates divine judgment followed by covenant. Across the globe, water was not just a resource, it was a moral and spiritual agent. Humans encoded memory into myth, preserving lessons about humility, respect for nature, and the fragility of life. Rebuilding civilization after floods also spurred technological innovation. Early humans learned to construct elevated dwellings, often on mounds or artificial platforms, to avoid future inundation. Archaeological evidence from Sumerian cities shows that ziggurats may have functioned not only as temples, but as refuges from high water. Similarly, in the Indus Valley, some buildings were raised on brick platforms, demonstrating an early understanding of flood mitigation. In essence, catastrophe drove adaptation. Survival depended on observing nature, predicting its cycles, and engineering solutions. Social structures evolved as well. In post-flood societies, communities often became more centralized. Leaders who could organize flood defenses, manage water resources, and coordinate rebuilding gained prominence. This pattern may explain the emergence of early kingship and governance in the Fertile Crescent. Catastrophe, it seems, did not merely destroy, it catalyzed human organization, ingenuity, and collective problem solving. Ecologically, floods forced humans to reassess their relationship with the land. Animals and plants displaced by rising waters required new hunting, domestication, and cultivation strategies. Certain species went extinct, while others thrived in altered habitats. Humans adapted alongside them, creating the first intentional agricultural systems. Floods may have accelerated domestication, as communities needed reliable food sources when familiar ecosystems vanished. By reshaping both the environment and human behavior, floods acted as an evolutionary pressure, subtly steering the development of civilization. The psychological impact of floods was profound. Survivors were acutely aware of nature's power and their own vulnerability. This awareness permeated art, ritual, and storytelling. Flood myths are filled with moral and ethical lessons. Humans must act wisely, live harmoniously, and respect divine or natural law. These narratives provided continuity, connecting post-flood generations to their ancestors and embedding survival knowledge in stories that would persist for millennia. Every retelling reinforced the central truth. Floods can wipe out what seems permanent, but human ingenuity can endure. Interestingly, some myths also celebrate resilience and renewal. After devastation, humanity emerges stronger, wiser, and more cooperative. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, after Utnapishtim survives the flood, he gains immortality and insight. Noah, after the ark rests, plants vineyards and establishes a covenant with the divine. These narratives convey hope. Floods destroy, but they also create opportunity. Post-catastrophe societies carried this optimism forward, building cities, developing agriculture, and fostering culture on foundations forged in crisis. The archaeological record supports this view. Across Europe, the Near East, and Asia, sites dating after 7000 BCE show renewed settlement, advanced agriculture, and increasingly complex social structures. Tools and pottery reveal cultural continuity, yet with adaptations likely influenced by environmental upheaval. Water management, in particular, emerges as a recurring theme, suggesting that societies learned not only to survive floods, but to harness water for growth. In many ways, the post-flood era marks humanity's first true step towards civilization as we recognize it today. Yet there were costs. Many small communities disappeared entirely, their memory surviving only in sediment and myth. Genetic studies suggest bottlenecks during this period, where population numbers dropped significantly, likely due to displacement, famine, or disease in the wake of flood events. In this light, the flood becomes more than legend. It is a real historical force that shaped the demographic, ecological, and cultural trajectory of humanity. And so, humanity rebuilt. From the submerged plains of Doggerland to the Black Sea's drowned villages, from river valleys across Mesopotamia to the Nile Delta, humans adapted to a world reshaped by water. They learned to read rivers, predict floods, engineer solutions, and encode wisdom into stories. Civilization, as we know it, is as much a product of disaster as it is of creativity. Without the challenge of floods, our understanding of adaptation, engineering, and social organization might have developed more slowly or in entirely different ways. The story of civilization after the flood is a story of resilience. It reminds us that human ingenuity is forged in adversity, that myths carry practical lessons, and that the memory of catastrophe can drive innovation. Water, once a destroyer, became a teacher. Humanity, once scattered and vulnerable, became organized, purposeful, and forward-looking. When we think of floods, most of us imagine rivers overflowing or storms battering coastlines. But the end of the last ice age brought something far more permanent: the slow, inexorable rise of seas that swallowed entire civilizations. Across the globe, land that had once teemed with life now rests beneath the waves, holding secrets that are only beginning to be uncovered. One of the most famous examples is Doggerland, a vast land bridge connecting Britain to mainland Europe. Today, the North Sea covers what was once a fertile plain, crisscrossed with rivers, forests, and human settlements. Archaeologists have pieced together its existence from sonar maps, ancient pollen, and bones of animals hunted by humans. Stone tools, bones, and remnants of structures recovered from the seabed tell a haunting story. People thrived here for thousands of years, only to vanish as the rising sea claimed their homes. For the communities who survived, this wasn't a distant disaster. It was the end of the world they knew. Further south, the Sunderland region of Southeast Asia offers another glimpse into lost civilizations. Modern-day Indonesia, Malaysia, and surrounding islands were once connected by land. Early human settlements thrived in this lowland, fishing rivers, farming, and building rudimentary structures. As sea levels rose, whole villages were submerged. Evidence is fragmentary, but compelling. Sonar mapping reveals sunken river valleys, while submerged reefs preserve tools and remnants of habitation. Some researchers suggest that these lost communities carried flood memories westward, influencing myths in the Near East and India. The Persian Gulf also hides its past beneath the water. Today, it is an inlet of the Arabian Sea. But during the late Pleistocene and early Holocene, it was a broad valley fed by the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Archaeologists have discovered evidence of ancient settlements along this now submerged coastline. These communities were among the earliest to practice agriculture, fish for food, and develop trade networks. As the seas rose, these settlements disappeared, leaving only sediment and stone, their stories preserved in myth and memory. One of the most tantalizing examples lies in the Black Sea itself. As discussed previously, the sudden flooding of this freshwater lake may have created a narrative seed for the world's flood myths. Submersible explorations and sonar scans have revealed underwater structures resembling piers, dwellings, and even possible ceremonial sites. While it is difficult to confirm whether these are remnants of permanent settlements or temporary encampments, their existence suggests a vibrant human presence abruptly displaced by water. Further afield, in the Mediterranean, there are legends of sunken cities, like Pavlopetrae in Greece, dating back over 5,000 years. Pavlopetrae lies under 4 meters of water, perfectly preserved in grid-like streets and stone buildings. It reveals a society with sophisticated urban planning, trade, and maritime culture, lost not to floods alone, but to a combination of rising seas and tectonic activity. These submerged cities hint at countless others, still undiscovered, lying silently beneath waves, their stories hidden for millennia. Even in the Americas, the evidence is compelling. Coastal settlements along the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean were inundated by post-Ice Age sea rise. Ancient Native American oral traditions speak of worlds beneath the water, of ancestors fleeing rising seas, while much of the archaeology remains underwater and difficult to access. Hints of these lost civilizations are preserved in submerged mounds, artifacts, and stories passed down through generations. What makes these lost civilizations so fascinating is not just their disappearance, but their impact on human memory and culture. Generations who survived these floods carried stories of vanished lands, of water that claimed the earth, and of divine or natural forces beyond human control. These stories became myths, legends, and religious narratives. The drowned landscapes themselves became symbols of caution, wisdom, and the fragility of human achievement. The end of the Ice Age, then, was both the literal and symbolic flood. The waters rose, the world changed, and humankind began its next chapter, scattered, yet united by the same experience of loss and renewal. There are few places on earth where myth and geology intersect as neatly as along the shores of the Black Sea. Here, beneath the quiet waves, lies a mystery that has haunted archaeologists and storytellers alike. Could this be the true birthplace of the Great Flood? Could a single, enormous inundation thousands of years ago have inspired the tales of Noah, of Utnapishtim, and of countless other flood survivors scattered across the ancient world? To understand this theory, we must travel back about 7,600 years to a time when the world looked familiar, but not quite as it does now. The last ice age had ended, the glaciers had retreated, and the oceans were still rising. The Mediterranean Sea, heavy with meltwater, pressed against the narrow land bridge that separated it from the Black Sea basin, a barrier located where the Bosporus Strait lies today, near modern Istanbul. On the northern side of that barrier stretched a vast freshwater lake. It was peaceful, isolated, surrounded by early human communities who fished, farmed, and settled its fertile shores. Then, one day, the ocean broke through. To visualize what happened, imagine a wall holding back a sea. Now picture that wall collapsing. When the waters of the Mediterranean finally overtopped the ridge, they did not trickle. They thundered. Some scientists estimate that more than 50 cubic kilometers of salt water poured into the Black Sea basin each day, carving the Bosporus Strait in mere months. The flood's roar would have echoed across continents. Coastal villages were obliterated. Entire landscapes disappeared beneath the advancing tide. Geologists William Ryan and Walter Pittman first proposed this theory in the late 1990s, building on decades of marine research. Their evidence was striking. Core samples from the Black Sea seafloor showed a sudden transition from freshwater sediments to marine ones, dated to around 5600 BCE. Buried beneath those sediments were the remains of ancient shorelines, proof that the water had once been hundreds of feet lower. But it was the nature of the transition that fascinated scientists most. The change from freshwater to saltwater species wasn't gradual, it was abrupt. Freshwater mollusks died off en masse, replaced almost overnight by saltwater species carried in by the invading sea. This pointed to a cataclysm, not a slow evolution. Something immense had happened here, and it had happened fast. Now imagine the people who lived around that lake. The early farmers, the fishermen, the small tight-knit communities that had begun to form the first villages of the Neolithic Age. They woke one morning to find the horizon shimmering strangely. Within days, perhaps even hours, they could hear a distant, growing roar. The ground trembled. The rivers reversed direction. Then, the wall of water appeared, a tide that would never retreat. They had no way to comprehend the scale of it. To them, this was not a flood of the local river. This was the world itself, filling with water. They fled inland, carrying little more than their tools, their families, and their memories of what had been lost. Over generations, those memories transformed into stories. Stories of divine wrath, of the sky weeping, of God's cleansing the earth, and choosing a single family or hero to survive. It is here that science begins to whisper in the same language as myth. The Black Sea Deluge hypothesis does not claim that the entire world drowned. It suggests something more human and more haunting, that a flood so large, so total, within the known world of its witnesses, could have felt global in scope. To those early survivors, the boundaries of their existence were defined by what they could see, and everything they could see was gone. Excavations around the modern Black Sea continue to reveal clues. Marine archaeologists have found what appear to be ancient river channels beneath the waves, as well as remnants of wooden structures buried in the sediment. In 2000, a team led by Robert Ballard, the oceanographer who discovered the Titanic, used submersibles to explore these underwater plains. They found what looked like the remains of a settlement, complete with worked timbers and artifacts, sitting far below the modern coastline. Radiocarbon dating placed them around the same age as the hypothesized flood. Was this one of the villages swallowed by the sea? If so, it would be the first direct evidence of human habitation drowned during the very event that might have birthed the world's most enduring myth. But as with all grand ideas, there are debates. Some scientists argue that the flooding of the Black Sea was not as sudden or dramatic as Ryan and Pittman proposed. They suggest a slower, more gradual inflow over centuries, one that may have displaced people, but not destroyed them overnight. Others propose that the water actually flowed out of the Black Sea before the Mediterranean breached the ridge, complicating the story further. Yet even if the deluge was less cinematic than we imagine, the psychological impact could still have been enormous. Human memory exaggerates trauma, not out of deceit, but out of emotion. A single generation forced to abandon its homeland would not have described the event as gradual. They would have remembered it as instant. When they retold the tale to their children, the water would rise faster, the gods would grow angrier, and the scope would expand from a valley to the entire earth. And so, through centuries of retelling, what began as a regional catastrophe became a universal parable. From the shores of the Black Sea, these displaced people moved outward, north into Europe, south into Mesopotamia, west into Greece, and east toward Persia. Each culture that arose from their descendants would carry echoes of the same story. The Mesopotamians would record it as the flood of Utnapishtim in the Epic of Gilgamesh. The Hebrews would tell it as Noah's Ark. The Greeks would remember Deucalion and Pyrrha. The echoes ripple outward still, a memory encoded in our oldest myths. This is the quiet power of the Black Sea Deluge hypothesis. It offers a bridge between geology and human storytelling. It suggests that the flood was real, but its global reach was emotional, not physical. It happened in one place, but in the imagination of those who survived, it happened to everyone. And perhaps that's the truest measure of a great catastrophe. It's not just the water that spreads, it's the memory, the sense that safety can vanish overnight, that even the most stable ground can betray you. When early farmers watched their fertile shores sink beneath salt water, they learned something profound about nature, that it gives and it takes, without warning, without mercy, without apology. The Black Sea deluge, then, may not only be the seed of the flood myth, it may be the seed of humanity's awareness of fragility. It taught us to build higher, to record, to remember. It made us storytellers, because survival alone was not enough. The story of survival had to endure too, as the seas stabilized and the world settled into its modern shape. Those stories became foundations of culture. But even as new lands rose and civilizations flourished, the question lingered: what if it happened again? What if the waters, once more, rose to reclaim the land? When the waters finally receded, they left behind a world both familiar and profoundly changed. Valleys were gone, coastlines had shifted, and fertile plains were now seabed. The floodwaters were not merely destructive, they were transformative. They scoured the land, deposited rich sediments, and reshaped the ecosystems that had sustained early communities. For humans, the challenge was not only survival, but reinvention. The flood had erased the old world, and humanity had to rise from its watery grave. Archaeological evidence suggests that post-flood human communities faced immense challenges. Settlements that had thrived along rivers or coastal plains were destroyed or submerged. In places like the Black Sea region, Mesopotamia, and the Indus Valley, people were forced to migrate, often moving inland or to higher ground. These migrations were not random. They followed resources: fresh water, fertile soil, and manageable terrain. Along the Nile, the rise of predictable flooding cycles encouraged the development of agriculture, irrigation systems, and centralized governance. Civilizations learned quickly: to survive, they had to control water, not merely endure it. Take Mesopotamia, for example. Known as the cradle of civilization, its earliest city-states rose on the fertile banks of the Tigris and Euphrates. Scholars argue that the memory of devastating floods may have motivated early engineering feats such as canals, levees, and reservoirs. Flood myths may have functioned as cautionary tales, reminding communities of the dual nature of water, essential for life, yet capable of total destruction. These early societies were learning to coexist with natural forces on a scale never seen before. Across the ancient world, we see similar patterns. In the Indus Valley, settlements such as Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa emerged near rivers that provided both sustenance and transportation. These cities demonstrate advanced urban planning with sophisticated drainage systems and wells, a direct response to the threat of floods. In Egypt, the annual inundation of the Nile became not a catastrophe, but a predictable boon, depositing nutrient-rich silt that sustained agriculture. The catastrophe of ancient floods became a blueprint for civilization: learn from the past, predict the cycles, and build accordingly. The science of underwater archaeology is unlocking more of these stories every year. Advanced sonar mapping, submersibles, and remote sensing technologies allow researchers to explore areas that were previously inaccessible. The seabed becomes a record of human history, preserving wooden structures, stone tools, pottery, and even entire settlements. Each discovery provides a snapshot of a world that vanished under rising seas, offering clues about how humans adapted, migrated, and rebuilt after catastrophe. The stories of these submerged civilizations are also a testament to human resilience. Even as their homes were lost, survivors carried knowledge, skills, and cultural memory forward. Communities migrated, adapted to new landscapes, and continued to innovate. The memory of floods shaped social organization, architecture, and myth, leaving an enduring imprint on humanity. In some ways, these submerged civilizations challenge our perspective of history. Much of what we consider ancient is incomplete because entire chapters lie beneath water. The oceans, rivers, and lakes are not empty. They are archives of human experience, holding secrets of adaptation, survival, and catastrophe. Each discovery is a reminder that the past is often hidden, waiting patiently for us to uncover it. And so, the story of humanity after the flood is not only one of destruction, but of enduring life. Lost cities beneath the waves are monuments to resilience, ingenuity, and memory. They remind us that while water can erase landscapes, it cannot erase knowledge, experience, or the human will to survive. Walk quietly through the corridors of human history, and you begin to notice something extraordinary. From the frozen tundras of the Arctic to the tropical islands of the Pacific, from the deserts of Africa to the river valleys of Mesopotamia, almost every culture carries a story of a great flood. These myths, while differing in detail, share a hauntingly similar pattern. Water rises, civilization is threatened, a hero or family survives, and the world is reborn. In Mesopotamia, one of the earliest recorded civilizations, we find the story of Utnapishtim in the Epic of Gilgamesh. Here, the gods decide to flood the world to punish humanity. Utnapishtim, warned in advance, builds a massive boat to save his family and representatives of all living creatures. When the waters recede, he releases birds to find land, and civilization begins anew. The parallels to the biblical story of Noah are striking, suggesting a shared cultural memory that may extend even further back into prehistory. In ancient India, the Satapatha Brahmana and later the Mahabharata recount the tale of Manu, a small fish, which later grows into the deity Vishnu, warns Manu of a coming flood. He builds a boat and survives, preserving life and knowledge for future generations. Like the Mesopotamian account, the emphasis is not only on survival, but on divine guidance and moral responsibility, reflecting the cultural lens through which the catastrophe is interpreted. Across China, the flood is depicted differently, not as divine punishment, but as a disruption of cosmic balance. Emperor Yu the Great becomes a hero by controlling the waters rather than fleeing them through engineering, canal building, and strategic water management. Yu restores harmony to the land. This version emphasizes human ingenuity and resilience, highlighting a cultural focus on balance, adaptation, and cooperation in the face of natural disasters. In the Pacific Islands, myths recount the story of Nu'u, who builds an ark to survive a great flood. After the waters subside, he offers sacrifices to the wrong deity, prompting correction by the god Cain, who descends on a rainbow. This narrative combines catastrophe with moral lesson, divine interaction, and the symbolic rebirth of the world, showing that the essential themes of destruction and renewal transcend geography. Among the indigenous peoples of North America, the flood is equally pervasive. The Ojibwe recount how a single man and a few animals survived on a raft, aided by a muskrat who retrieved mud to recreate the land. The Hopi speak of a world destroyed by flood for spiritual failings, with survivors emerging from hollow reeds. In both cases, the flood becomes a vehicle for teaching spiritual and ethical lessons, reinforcing the link between human behavior and the natural world. Even in Central and South America, flood myths abound. The Aztecs tell of Nata and Nena surviving a deluge sent by the god Tezcatlipoca. The Mayans describe a world where the gods destroy the first humans made of wood for lacking souls and gratitude, then remake humanity from corn. The recurrence of divine intervention, destruction, and renewal mirrors the motifs seen across Asia, the Middle East, and the Pacific. What is remarkable is not just the frequency of these myths, but their consistency of structure. Across continents, we see recurring motifs. A warning is given, a vessel or refuge is constructed, selected survivors preserve life, animals or seeds are saved to repopulate the earth. The waters recede, often with signs like mountains, birds, or rainbows, indicating safe land. This consistency suggests more than coincidence. While local floods may have inspired regional myths, the repeated structure hints at a shared human response to trauma. Water, as a force of destruction and renewal, became a universal metaphor, a canvas onto which humans projected both fear and hope. Some researchers propose that these shared myths reflect collective memory of post-ice age floods, rising seas, glacial bursts, and catastrophic events like the Black Sea deluge may have been experienced differently across regions, yet left an imprint on human consciousness. Over generations, oral traditions preserved these memories, exaggerating the scale and moral significance until they became embedded in culture and religion. Anthropologically, flood myths serve multiple purposes. They are moral lessons, warning communities about hubris, greed, or disregard for the natural world. They are educational, encoding practical knowledge about water management, survival, and adaptation. And they are psychological, helping societies cope with trauma by creating narratives that give meaning to catastrophic events. Interestingly, the myths also reveal how humans perceive cosmic order and chaos. Floods are rarely random. They are moral or cosmic tests. In Mesopotamia, India, and Mesoamerica, divine forces act deliberately. Even when floods are framed as natural events, as in China, they symbolize imbalance. Across all cultures, the flood represents disruption and the necessity of restoration, whether through divine favor, human ingenuity, or both. Moreover, the spread of flood myths highlights cultural transmission and adaptation. As humans migrated, carried stories, and interacted with new environments, myths evolved, details changed, names, deities, geography, but the core narrative endured. This evolution shows the resilience of human memory and the deep psychological need to preserve lessons from catastrophe. Modern science and archaeology increasingly support the notion that these myths are rooted in real events. Rising sea levels, melting glaciers, and regional deluges are well documented, with dates aligning roughly with the emergence of these stories. Submerged settlements in Doggerland, Sunderland, and the Black Sea suggest that humans were indeed displaced by water on a massive scale. These events, filtered through memory and myth-making, became the stories that unite humanity's understanding of its fragility and resilience. In a sense, flood myths are humanity's first global phenomenon. Despite differences in language, climate, and geography, the pattern of story repeats: destruction, survival, rebirth. They illustrate the universality of human experience, the way we respond to natural disaster, encode lessons, and pass them across generations. Water, both feared and revered, becomes a lens through which humans understand mortality, morality, and survival. The study of these myths also reminds us that memory is powerful. Even millennia after the events, humans preserve the essence of catastrophe in story, ritual, and cultural identity. Across continents, a shared motif emerges that life can be threatened, but it can endure. That catastrophe can strike suddenly, but knowledge, ingenuity, and morality can guide survival. In every flood myth, one element stands out as essential: the preservation of life, whether through a vessel, a refuge, or divine intervention. Humans understood that the survival of the species depended not just on people, but on animals, seeds, and the essential building blocks of ecosystems. These elements carry profound symbolism, reflecting both practical survival strategies and deep cultural understanding. The biblical story of Noah is perhaps the most famous example. Noah's Ark was not only a refuge for humans, it carried representatives of every species. Birds, mammals, and creeping creatures were preserved so that life could continue after the waters receded. This reflects an intuitive understanding of biodiversity. Without animals, ecosystems collapse. The narrative encodes both a moral and ecological lesson. Survival is not merely human, it is shared with all living beings. Similar patterns appear in other cultures. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, Utnapishtim preserves animals and seeds of grain. In the story of Manu in India, life is saved through divine guidance, ensuring that the natural order remains intact. Across the Pacific Islands, flood survivors carry provisions and animals on their boats, emphasizing the importance of sustaining life beyond immediate survival. These recurring motifs demonstrate a universal recognition that continuity requires foresight and care for the environment. Seeds and plants play an equally critical role. Agriculture was emerging during the periods associated with these floods, and early humans relied on predictable crops for sustenance. Preserving seeds ensured that they could reestablish food sources after catastrophe. In myth, seeds often symbolize hope and renewal. Their survival guarantees that the world will not only endure, but also regenerate. For example, after the floodwaters receded, Noah planted vineyards. In India, Manu's preserved grains allowed communities to resume cultivation. Across cultures, the motif underscores a practical truth. Life can be paused, but it must be restarted intentionally. Animals in these myths also serve symbolic and spiritual purposes. Birds often represent the ability to explore beyond immediate danger. Releasing birds to scout for land is a recurrent motif, from the raven and dove in the biblical story to the muskrat or turtle in Native American narratives. These animals are both literal and symbolic guides, illustrating awareness, adaptation, and the search for stability amid chaos. Water itself is both destroyer and preserver. The floodwaters erase the old world, yet the creatures and seeds carried safely through them ensure continuity. Life is resilient. The narratives convey that catastrophe is not absolute. It is a reset mechanism that allows renewal. Humanity, animals, and plants form a continuum. The survival of one depends on the survival of all. Beyond practical survival, these motifs also express deeper philosophical ideas. They emphasize interconnectedness. Humans are part of a larger ecological system. Displacement, destruction, and renewal are part of a cycle that affects every living being. By embedding these lessons into myth, early humans communicated ecological wisdom that transcended generations. It is an early form of understanding sustainability. Long before the term existed, the emphasis on preservation extends to cultural knowledge as well. Just as seeds, animals, and humans were saved, so were ideas, skills, and stories. Myths encode memory, ensuring that lessons learned from catastrophe are not lost. Storytelling itself becomes a vessel of preservation, carrying collective wisdom forward even when the physical world has changed irreversibly. In this way, culture mirrors nature. Both survive through adaptation and careful stewardship. Archaeological discoveries reinforce these lessons. Ancient storage pits, granaries, and animal pens indicate that early humans actively prepared for environmental stress. In submerged sites like Doggerland or Sunderland, evidence of domesticated animals and stored grains suggests deliberate strategies to ensure survival. Myth and material culture converge, showing that the narrative of preserved life was rooted in lived experience. The symbolism of preserved life also has a psychological dimension. During a flood, survivors witness the destruction of familiar landscapes and communities. By focusing on life that endures, animals, seeds, family, they maintain hope. Myths serve as cognitive anchors, providing reassurance that catastrophe is temporary and renewal is possible. These stories teach resilience, patience, and foresight, qualities essential for thriving in a changing world. Finally, the theme of life preserved illustrates a universal principle. Continuity depends on balance. Human survival alone is insufficient. It relies on a healthy ecosystem and the careful maintenance of species diversity. Early myths, in codifying this truth, anticipate modern ecological understanding. They remind us that water can destroy, but it can also carry life forward, and that survival requires respect, planning, and cooperation across species. Life preserved through animals, seeds, and cultural memory becomes a bridge between catastrophe and renewal. It teaches that even in moments of immense loss, there is continuity, and that hope, foresight, and stewardship are as essential as courage. The recurring motifs in flood myths reflect not only survival strategies, but also the enduring human capacity to interpret and honor the rhythms of nature. Beneath our feet, the earth keeps a meticulous record of its own history. Layers of rock, sediment, and fossilized remains tell stories of cataclysmic floods that have reshaped landscapes, altered climates, and influenced the course of human civilization, while myths and legends preserve the emotional memory of floods. Geology preserves their physical reality. One of the most compelling pieces of evidence comes from sedimentary layers. In river valleys and coastal plains, scientists observe sequences of sand, silt, and clay deposited in sudden, high-energy events. Unlike the slow accumulation of soil over centuries, these layers are often thick, uniform, and contain debris, indicating rapid water movement. In the North American Midwest, for example, the deposits of the Missoula floods, enormous glacial outburst floods, remain visible today as ripple marks hundreds of meters across. These floods, which occurred near the end of the last ice age, demonstrate that water can carve and reshape entire regions within days or weeks. In the Black Sea, cores drilled from the seafloor reveal an abrupt transition from freshwater to saltwater sediments around 5600 BCE. This supports the hypothesis of a sudden, massive inundation, possibly the Black Sea Deluge, that replaced a freshwater ecosystem with marine conditions almost overnight. Fossilized freshwater mollusks, buried under layers of saltwater species, provide tangible proof of this cataclysmic transformation. These geological markers corroborate human stories of a sudden flood that reshaped entire landscapes and forced mass migrations. Glacial regions provide another rich source of evidence. During the Ice Age, enormous lakes formed behind ice dams, natural reservoirs of meltwater held back by glaciers. When these ice barriers failed, glacial outburst floods, or Jökullaups, unleashed water with unimaginable force. Evidence of these floods is visible today in the scoured channels, dry valleys, and sediment deposits across North America, Europe, and Asia. For instance, the channeled scablands in eastern Washington state were carved by repeated outbursts from glacial Lake Missoula. Rocks weighing tons were moved, entire hills eroded, and valleys deepened in a matter of days. This demonstrates that the Earth is capable of sudden, dramatic flooding events on a scale that could inspire myths. Beyond individual events, global sea level rise provides a longer-term record of flood-related changes. Ice cores, corals, and sediment cores indicate that sea levels rose rapidly at several points during the transition from the Pleistocene to the Holocene epoch. Meltwater pulses, such as Meltwater Pulse 1A, around 14,600 years ago, caused sea levels to rise several meters within decades. These rapid changes would have inundated coastal settlements worldwide, leaving behind submerged archaeological sites and marine terraces as enduring evidence of the rise. Additionally, Paleolake studies offer insights into regional floods. Ancient lakes, such as Lake Agassiz in North America or Lake Bonneville in the western United States, periodically overflowed, sending catastrophic torrents downstream. These outflows left behind massive alluvial fans, gravel bars, and sedimentary deposits visible for thousands of years. The sudden draining of these lakes would have displaced communities and reshaped entire river systems, leaving physical traces that persist long after human memory has faded. Fossils also tell a story. Mass mortality events among animals buried in flood deposits indicate that sudden inundations wiped out populations. For instance, fossils of freshwater fish and mammals found in sediment layers show abrupt environmental changes, sometimes correlating with rising seas or catastrophic flooding. These biological markers, combined with geological data, provide a multidimensional view of flood events, the land, the water, and the life that it carried or destroyed. Tectonic activity adds another layer of complexity. Earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, and land subsidence can trigger localized or regional floods. Tsunamis, generated by undersea earthquakes, deposit sand, shells, and other debris far inland. Evidence of ancient tsunamis has been found in the Indian Ocean, the Mediterranean, and the Caribbean, demonstrating that flood events can occur suddenly without warning and leave permanent geological signatures. One of the most intriguing aspects of this evidence is its correlation with archaeological records. Submerged settlements in the Black Sea, Doggerland, Sunderland, and along other ancient coastlines correspond closely with periods of rising seas, glacial melt, and sudden flooding. Geological evidence and human artifacts together provide a compelling picture. Floods were not merely stories, they were lived, transformative events that shaped ecosystems, displaced populations, and created the myths that endure today. Finally, these geological studies emphasize the scale and diversity of floods. They were not uniform. Some were catastrophic and sudden, while others were slow, progressive, or regionally contained. Yet each type left a permanent mark, whether through sedimentary deposits, submerged structures, or fossil records. The Earth's geology, in essence, is a layered archive of disaster and recovery, a silent testament to the immense power of water and the resilience of life that persists above and below the surface. Through these physical records, we gain a deeper appreciation of floods as both natural and historical forces. The traces left in rock, sediment, and fossilized life are enduring evidence that the stories passed down through generations are rooted in reality. Humanity's memory of water, encoded in myth, art, and culture, aligns with the very ground beneath our feet, reminding us that while floods can erase, they also reveal the extraordinary resilience of life and the world it inhabits. The retreat of glaciers and the flooding of landscapes did more than reshape coastlines. They altered the very climate systems that govern life on Earth. As ice melted and oceans rose, the world entered a period of profound environmental transformation, one that would influence vegetation, wildlife, and human civilization for millennia. These climatic shifts were subtle yet relentless, and their fingerprints remain in ice cores, sediment layers, and fossil records. One of the most immediate effects of post-ice age flooding was the redistribution of water. Melting glaciers released immense volumes of fresh water into the oceans, diluting salt levels, affecting ocean currents, and changing the global heat balance. These changes influenced rainfall patterns across continents. Regions that had been arid during the Ice Age became more fertile, while previously stable environments could suddenly experience droughts or floods. Human populations had to adapt quickly, learning new agricultural techniques and migration strategies in response to shifting climate conditions. The Laurentide and Fennoscandian ice sheets covering much of North America and Northern Europe melted unevenly. The sudden release of meltwater into the Atlantic Ocean may have disrupted the thermohaline circulation, a critical system of ocean currents that regulates climate by moving warm and cold water around the globe. Scientists believe this caused abrupt, temporary cooling events known as younger Dryas fluctuations, where temperatures plummeted for decades or even centuries. Communities dependent on predictable climates suddenly faced unpredictable winters, impacting agriculture, hunting, and settlement patterns. Rising seas also created new coastlines and inland seas, which had cascading effects on regional climates. Large bodies of water moderate temperature and humidity, creating microclimates that either encouraged human settlement or forced migration. For example, the newly expanded Mediterranean and Black Sea influenced rainfall in surrounding regions, promoting fertile valleys and river deltas while making some lowlands prone to periodic flooding. These environmental shifts shaped where civilizations could thrive and where human adaptation was necessary for survival. As glaciers receded, they exposed freshly scoured soils, initially barren but gradually colonized by pioneer plant species. These early ecosystems set the stage for forests, grasslands, and agricultural regions that would sustain human populations. Floodwaters deposited nutrient-rich sediments on plains and valleys, enriching soils, but also temporarily disrupting existing vegetation. Humans learned to exploit these new fertile areas, but only after cycles of trial, error, and adaptation. Climatic shifts also affected wildlife distribution. Animals displaced by floods or changing temperatures migrated, died off, or adapted to new habitats. Human populations followed these migrations, tracking herds for hunting or domesticating species better suited to post-flood conditions. For example, the retreating glaciers and changing rainfall patterns facilitated the spread of domesticated animals like sheep, goats, and cattle in Eurasia. These shifts fundamentally altered human diets, economies, and settlement strategies. One particularly striking consequence was the rise of megadeltas, river mouths inundated by rising seas. The Nile Delta, the Indus River Valley, and the Tigris-Euphrates Delta expanded dramatically, creating highly fertile agricultural zones. These regions became cradles of early civilization, where humans harnessed floodwaters for irrigation, trade, and settlement. The memory of earlier catastrophic floods likely informed the careful management of these waters, as communities engineered canals, levees, and reservoirs to prevent future disasters. Climate shifts also prompted migration and cultural diffusion. Rising seas displaced coastal populations, driving them inland or toward more temperate regions. This movement facilitated the exchange of technologies, ideas, and cultural practices. Flooded regions like Doggerland, Sunderland, and the Persian Gulf Valley forced communities to relocate, creating networks of interaction that shaped language, myth, and societal organization. Catastrophe thus became a driver of cultural complexity. Even global phenomena were affected. Sudden pulses of fresh water into the oceans may have influenced monsoon patterns, shifting the timing and intensity of seasonal rains in South Asia, Africa, and the Americas. These changes would have impacted agricultural cycles, river levels, and the distribution of flora and fauna. Human societies that could anticipate and adapt to these patterns gained a survival advantage, while others faced food shortages, migration, or cultural collapse. The post-flood climatic changes also left evidence in natural archives. Ice cores from Greenland and Antarctica show variations in temperature and atmospheric composition, while tree rings and pollen deposits reveal shifts in vegetation and rainfall. Coral reefs, sediment cores, and isotopic analyses provide further proof of how water redistribution influenced global climate. Together, these records paint a vivid picture of a planet in transition, responding to the sudden influx of water and the retreat of ice. Human perception of these changes was not purely practical, it shaped spiritual and mythological understanding. The unpredictability of climate reinforced the belief that floods and storms were expressions of divine will or cosmic imbalance. Stories of catastrophic floods were intertwined with lessons about respect for nature, the consequences of hubris, and the necessity of preparation. In essence, climate became part of the cultural memory, encoded in narrative as well as practice. In sum, floods did not merely reshape the land, they reshaped the world's climate, ecosystems, and human society. Rising seas, glacial melt, and redistributed water transformed rainfall, agriculture, wildlife, and settlement patterns. Humanity learned to observe, adapt, and engineer solutions, giving rise to agriculture, urban planning, and water management. The end of the Ice Age was more than a physical transformation. It was a climatic and ecological reorganization that set the stage for civilization as we know it. After the floods reshaped the world, humans faced an unprecedented challenge: how to survive and thrive in a transformed environment. Rising seas had swallowed familiar lands, river courses had shifted, and fertile plains were suddenly underwater. For early humans, survival no longer meant merely following herds or gathering wild plants. It required deliberate planning, experimentation, and adaptation. This period marks one of the most transformative chapters in human history: the rise of agriculture and the dawn of civilization. In regions like the Fertile Crescent, the aftermath of flooding created nutrient-rich soils in valleys and floodplains. The sediments deposited by retreating waters were ideal for the cultivation of grains such as wheat and barley. Early humans observed these areas carefully, noting where plants thrived and where animals grazed. Through trial and error, they learned to sow, cultivate, and harvest systematically. Floods, once a destructive force, inadvertently provided the raw materials for sustainable agriculture, encouraging humans to settle in one place rather than migrate continuously. The Indus Valley and Nile Delta illustrate another key adaptation: harnessing water management. Humans built canals, dikes, and reservoirs to control the flow of rivers, mitigate floods, and irrigate crops. These innovations were not simple engineering feats. They required observation of seasonal patterns, knowledge of hydrology, and cooperative labor. Communities that mastered water management could support larger populations, giving rise to cities and complex societies. In essence, adaptation to flood-prone environments accelerated technological and social innovation. The development of domestication was closely tied to post-flood survival, with familiar hunting grounds submerged or displaced. Humans turned increasingly to animals and plants they could control. Sheep, goats, cattle, and pigs became critical sources of protein, milk, and labor. Likewise, wild grains, legumes, and tubers were selectively cultivated. This shift from foraging to farming transformed human diets, economic structures, and social organization. Floods may have acted as catalysts, forcing humans to transition from dependence on unpredictable ecosystems to intentional cultivation and animal husbandry. Settlement patterns also changed dramatically. Humans began to cluster near rivers, deltas, and other reliable water sources, creating permanent or semi-permanent villages. Sites such as Jericho, Catalhoyuk, Mohenjo-Daro, and Harappa demonstrate the sophistication of early urban planning. Defensive walls, communal granaries, and drainage systems reflect both a response to environmental risk and an early understanding of collective security. Floods influenced where people could safely live, prompting innovation in architecture and urban design. Elevated platforms, stilt houses, and fortified settlements became standard solutions in regions vulnerable to inundation. Cultural adaptation went hand in hand with practical adaptation. Flood myths, rituals, and oral traditions served as social memory, transmitting knowledge of safe locations, agricultural timing, and water management practices. By encoding lessons into stories, communities preserved survival strategies across generations. These narratives reinforced behavioral norms, cooperation, preparation, and respect for natural forces, ensuring that societies learned from previous disasters rather than repeating mistakes. Climatic shifts following floods also drove agricultural diversification. Rainfall patterns, temperature fluctuations, and soil variability required experimentation with multiple crops and techniques. Early farmers developed crop rotation, selective breeding, and irrigation strategies to optimize yield. Communities adapted not only to immediate environmental pressures, but also to long-term climatic variability, creating resilient agricultural systems capable of sustaining growing populations. In some regions, floods also facilitated trade and exchange. Coastal migration and the displacement of populations encouraged interaction between communities that had previously been isolated. Fertile floodplains became hubs for surplus production, enabling trade in grains, livestock, tools, and cultural artifacts. This exchange promoted technological innovation, cultural diffusion, and economic interdependence, laying the foundation for more complex civilizations. Post-flood adaptation extended beyond survival. It influenced spiritual and social organization. Humans perceived water as both life-giving and destructive, embedding its dual nature into religious practices and governance. Agricultural cycles were intertwined with ritual calendars. Floods were commemorated in myths, and seasonal inundation informed festival timing. These cultural responses reinforced societal cohesion, helping communities navigate the uncertainties of a changing world. The combination of agriculture, settlement, and water management enabled humans to expand into previously marginal lands. flooded regions eventually stabilized, allowing repopulation, cultivation, and trade. Humans transformed the environment to support larger, denser populations. The memory of floods shaped not only the physical landscape, but the social, economic, and cultural frameworks that underpinned early civilization. Ultimately, the post-flood era demonstrates the profound interdependence between environment and human innovation. Catastrophe prompted observation, experimentation, and problem solving. Humanity responded to rising waters not with resignation, but with creativity and foresight. Agriculture became both a survival strategy and a cultural touchstone, reflecting lessons learned from nature's most formidable challenge. Life after floods was not merely a continuation, it was a transformation. Water has always held a paradoxical place in human perception. It is life-giving, nourishing crops, sustaining animals, and replenishing drinking sources, yet it is also a force of destruction, capable of sweeping away homes, crops, and entire communities. For early humans, the experience of catastrophic floods prompted profound spiritual reflection. Across cultures, floods were interpreted not merely as natural phenomena, but as divine acts, moral lessons, or cosmic adjustments. The result was a rich tapestry of religious and spiritual responses that shaped human culture and morality. In Mesopotamia, floods were intimately tied to the will of the gods. The Epic of Gilgamesh depicts a world where human misbehavior provokes divine retribution. Utnapishtim is warned of an impending deluge, built an ark, and preserved life. Here, the flood serves multiple spiritual purposes. It enforces morality, demonstrates the authority of the divine, and offers a template for human obedience and survival. It is not the flood itself, but the ethical and religious interpretation that becomes central to culture. Similarly, in the Hebrew Bible, the story of Noah's Ark emphasizes moral responsibility. The flood is portrayed as a response to human wickedness, yet survival is granted to the righteous and obedient. Rituals, covenants, and the symbolic rainbow reinforce humanity's accountability to divine law. Floods are thus encoded as both punishment and opportunity, a duality reflected in countless religious frameworks worldwide. In ancient India, floods are connected with cycles of cosmic order and dharma. Manu's survival, guided by the deity Vishnu, preserves not only life, but the principles of order and righteousness. The flood narrative here is not purely punitive, it is instructive. It teaches humans how to act in accordance with the laws of the universe and emphasizes the necessity of wisdom, preparation, and ethical conduct. This spiritual framing of floods underscores the belief that natural disasters are intertwined with moral and cosmic balance. Flood myths in China highlight human ingenuity as a spiritual virtue. The tale of Yu the Great focuses on controlling floods rather than escaping them. By building canals, redirecting rivers, and managing water resources, Yu restores harmony between humans and nature. In this context, spiritual fulfillment is achieved through action, discipline, and the ethical management of resources, blending practical engineering with moral responsibility. Across the Pacific and in Native American traditions, floods are linked to ritual purification and renewal. Catastrophe is a cleansing force, washing away corruption or imbalance. Survivors emerge with renewed purpose, often guided by spirits, animals, or deities. Flood narratives reinforce social cohesion by encoding lessons about cooperation, respect for the environment, and adherence to spiritual codes. Myths serve as living instruction manuals for navigating danger and understanding one's place in the natural and divine order. In Mesoamerica, floods are tied to cycles of creation and destruction. The Aztec and Mayan myths describe successive worlds destroyed by water, fire, and wind. Each deluge is a reset, demonstrating that human existence is contingent on divine favor and ethical alignment. Rituals surrounding rain, water management, and agricultural cycles reflect a spiritual acknowledgement of water's dual role as sustainer and destroyer. The floods themselves become sacred events embedded into collective consciousness and ritual calendars. Religious responses to floods also often involve symbolism and metaphors. Water represents rebirth, transformation, and moral purification. Ark-like vessels or elevated refuges symbolize safety and spiritual guidance. Birds, animals, or seeds that survive the deluge symbolize hope and continuity. In many traditions, the flood marks the boundary between a corrupted past and a renewed world, emphasizing cycles of death and renewal as inherent to existence. Furthermore, floods influence the development of prayers, offerings, and festivals. Societies would appeal to deities for protection against future inundations, perform rituals to ensure rainfall or fertility, and commemorate ancestral survival. These practices reinforced communal memory, teaching younger generations the dangers of water and the importance of ethical conduct. Religion thus functioned as both spiritual guidance and practical disaster management, intertwining myth, morality, and survival. Even in philosophical terms, floods became a lens for contemplating human vulnerability. They illustrate the limits of human control, the transience of civilization, and the necessity of humility. Across cultures, the spiritual interpretation of floods fosters reflection on life, mortality, and humanity's place within the natural and cosmic order. They encourage foresight, ethical living, and cooperation, qualities critical for both survival and societal development. Ultimately, religious and spiritual responses to floods demonstrate a universal human need to understand catastrophe. By framing floods in moral, cosmic, or ritualistic terms, early societies created structures to cope with uncertainty. These frameworks guided human behavior, reinforced community bonds, and preserved essential knowledge about survival and adaptation. In this way, flood myths and spiritual traditions are more than stories. They are cultural lifelines, preserving lessons from an era when water could erase everything familiar. Floods, despite their destructive force, acted as powerful catalysts for human innovation. Early humans learned that survival was not solely dependent on fleeing danger, but on understanding, predicting, and controlling water. This necessity spurred the development of technologies that transformed society. One of the earliest innovations was water management. In Mesopotamia, communities constructed canals, levees, and reservoirs to control the Tigris and Euphrates. These systems allowed for irrigation, protected settlements, and supported agriculture in previously marginal areas. In China, Yu the Great's legendary canal projects reflect a similar ingenuity, demonstrating how large-scale engineering was driven directly by the need to mitigate floods. These projects required social coordination, leadership, and long-term planning, laying foundations for organized civilization. Floods also encouraged architecture and urban planning. Elevated platforms, stilt houses, and terraced fields became standard in flood-prone areas. Cities like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa show sophisticated drainage systems designed to handle seasonal inundation. Pavlopetri in Greece demonstrates the same principle. Urban layouts adapted to rising water while facilitating trade and social cohesion. Even simple innovations like clay storage for seeds or water-resistant tools reflect the human response to environmental threat. Transportation and maritime technology evolved as well. Boats, rafts, and floating devices were essential for survival, and later became central to trade networks. The knowledge gained from navigating floodwaters likely contributed to broader seafaring and trade innovation. In essence, floods acted as teachers, compelling humans to observe natural forces, experiment, and engineer solutions. Technology born of catastrophe not only ensured survival, but laid the groundwork for complex societies. The reshaping of landscapes by floods triggered massive human migrations, submerged coastlines, altered rivers, and disappearing plains forced populations to relocate, often over long distances. These migrations were not chaotic. They followed resources, fertile land, and safe terrain, ultimately shaping settlement patterns worldwide. In Europe, the flooding of Doggerland displaced thousands, driving populations toward higher ground in Britain, France, and Scandinavia. Similarly, the inundation of Sunderland pushed communities into mainland Southeast Asia, creating new population centers and facilitating cultural exchange. In Mesopotamia, survivors of local deluges moved toward the Nile and Tigris-Euphrates deltas, leading to concentrated civilizations in fertile floodplains. Migration also encouraged cultural diffusion. As communities encountered new environments and neighboring groups, they exchanged technologies, stories, and religious practices. Floods, by breaking old boundaries, inadvertently accelerated trade, language development, and the sharing of agricultural techniques. Population shifts also prompted adaptation to new ecological zones. Humans learned to cultivate new crops, domesticate animals suited to different climates, and modify their shelters to handle unfamiliar environmental risks. In effect, floods reshaped human geography, concentrating knowledge and fostering resilience. Floods were more than physical events. They were profound psychological experiences. The sudden destruction of familiar landscapes created trauma, fear, and uncertainty, leaving deep marks on human consciousness. Myths, rituals, and communal storytelling arose as mechanisms for processing this trauma. Repeatedly, flood narratives emphasize survival, moral responsibility, and continuity. By encoding lessons in myth, humans created cognitive frameworks to navigate uncertainty, teaching future generations how to anticipate disaster and cooperate. Animals, seeds, and boats became symbols of foresight and hope, while divine intervention emphasized ethical behavior. Flood experiences also fostered community cohesion. Survival required collaboration, shared labor, and trust. Rituals and festivals commemorating floods reinforced social bonds and collective memory. Psychological resilience emerged alongside technological and cultural adaptation, making floods not only a force of destruction, but a driver of human ingenuity and empathy. The enduring presence of flood myths in global cultures reflects this deep psychological imprint. They are reminders of vulnerability, the necessity of preparation, and the hope that even after total loss, life can endure and flourish. Floods were not merely destructive events, they were ecological forces that reshaped the distribution of species, habitats, and ecosystems. Rising waters, sediment deposits, and displaced rivers altered landscapes, creating new opportunities for flora and fauna while challenging human survival. Floodwaters deposited nutrient rich sediments, rejuvenating soils, and creating fertile plains ideal for agriculture. This ecological reset allowed plant species to flourish in new areas, encouraging early humans to experiment with cultivation and domestication. Forests regenerated in previously barren regions, wetlands expanded, and new river systems formed, creating habitats for diverse wildlife. Animals, both wild and domesticated, were heavily affected. Some species were driven to extinction in localized regions, while others adapted to newly formed floodplains. Humans had to track animal migration and develop new hunting or domestication strategies. The symbiotic relationship between humans, plants, and animals became critical. Preserving biodiversity was not only essential for survival, but also influenced mythology, where animals often symbolize guidance, resilience, and continuity. Floods also created barriers and corridors for migration. Coastal areas were submerged, forcing species, including humans, to relocate. Conversely, newly formed rivers and lakes facilitated dispersal, promoting ecological and genetic diversity. Wetlands and deltas became rich ecosystems supporting both humans and wildlife, acting as incubators of innovation, settlement, and food production. In essence, floods acted as natural engineers, shaping ecosystems and influencing evolutionary pressures. They created a dynamic environment that demanded observation, adaptation, and cooperation. Humanity's ecological awareness, myth making, and agricultural practices were profoundly shaped by these post flood landscapes. Floods left an indelible mark not only on the land, but on human imagination. Across continents, cultures integrated flood experiences into myths, rituals, art, and architecture, creating a shared framework of memory and moral teaching. Artistic depictions, stone carvings, pottery, murals, and even oral storytelling often illustrate water, boats, and animals. These visual narratives encoded survival lessons, moral guidance, and communal history, preserving knowledge across generations. For example, Mesopotamian cylinder seals depict boats carrying animals and humans, echoing the story of Utnapishtim. In Mesoamerica, murals and codices reference deluges and divine judgment, linking environmental catastrophe to ethical and social norms. Myths functioned as cultural glue, uniting displaced populations. Communities that migrated after floods carried these narratives with them, spreading motifs, symbols, and rituals across regions. This cultural integration facilitated trade, language exchange, and the diffusion of technology. Flood myths thus became both moral and practical guides, teaching survival, cooperation, and ecological stewardship. In societies affected by repeated floods, rituals and festivals reinforced collective memory. Annual ceremonies often coincided with seasonal inundation, connecting human activity to natural cycles. These events solidified social cohesion, reinforced ethical principles, and maintained awareness of environmental risk. In this way, floods shaped not only survival strategies, but also the very structure of human culture and communal identity. Even today, the legacy of ancient floods informs science, urban planning, and climate awareness. Archaeology, geology, and mythology provide insights into human adaptation, resilience, and ecological management. Understanding how our ancestors coped with rising waters can guide modern flood preparedness, water management, and climate adaptation strategies. Ancient flood myths, while often symbolic, reflect real environmental events. Submerged cities, glacial outburst evidence, and sedimentary records demonstrate the scale and frequency of flooding in the past. Modern scientists study these events to predict coastal vulnerability, understand sea level rise, and anticipate ecological shifts caused by climate change. Technological responses, dams, levees, canals, and early urban drainage systems were inspired by ancient innovations. Modern infrastructure continues to draw lessons from these early experiments in water management. Socially, myths emphasize the importance of community cooperation, foresight, and ethical stewardship, lessons that remain relevant in disaster planning and climate resilience today. In a broader sense, floods remind humanity of its fragility and adaptability. They are forces that erase, but also teach. The continuity of life, ecological balance, and cultural memory all depend on observing natural forces, learning from them, and acting collectively. Ancient floods, myths, and innovations provide both a historical record and a moral framework for navigating contemporary environmental challenges. Beneath oceans, lakes, and riverbeds, archaeologists are uncovering the remnants of civilizations lost to floods. Sunken cities, submerged settlements, and artifacts reveal the scale of human adaptation and survival. Sites like Doggerland, Pavlopetri in Greece, and the Persian Gulf Valley illustrate that humans thrived in areas now underwater. Advanced technologies, sonar mapping, submersibles, and underwater excavation allow researchers to locate and study these lost communities. Pottery, tools, and structural remnants provide insight into daily life, social organization, and disaster preparedness. These discoveries confirm that floods were not abstract myths. They were lived experiences shaping human culture, settlement, and innovation. Archaeology also highlights migration patterns, showing how populations relocated after inundations. Submerged landscapes serve as time capsules, preserving evidence of human ingenuity and resilience. By studying these sites, we gain a tangible connection to the stories passed down in myths and legends, bridging history with science. Floods repeatedly tested human ingenuity, social organization, and adaptability. Survivors learned to anticipate seasonal changes, store food, domesticate animals, and construct durable settlements. Communities developed shared knowledge encoded in myths, rituals, and social practices, ensuring continuity across generations. Psychologically, humans adapted by creating stories that explained catastrophe and offered hope. Symbols like arcs, seeds, and animals reinforced moral guidance and survival strategies. Socially, cooperation became essential for constructing flood defenses, managing resources, and sustaining populations. Human resilience after floods demonstrates a timeless principle. Adversity drives innovation, strengthens communities, and fosters ethical and ecological awareness. The ability to endure and rebuild became a cornerstone of civilization, leaving a legacy still relevant in contemporary disaster management and climate adaptation. Now, with a smile on your face, you will have a good understanding of what happened to our Earth during and after the floods, and a sense of awe at the resilience and ingenuity of life. It's time to let these stories guide you into calm reflection and a peaceful sleep. Goodbye, dear friend. See you next time.